1 Samuel, you know that David is now on the throne, ruling as king, because Saul is dead. But what you also know is David is still not ruling a united kingdom. There's still a threat to his monarchy, and the threat is the rest of Saul's family. So what we have in 2 Samuel is David's unification of the kingdom as Judah unites with the rest of Israel and becomes the nation of Israel. The author and date, for the discussion of author and date, you just need to see the introduction to 1 Samuel again and listen to the first part of the introduction to 1 Samuel, because it's the same. As we said, it was originally written as one book by the same author at the same time for the same purpose, to show the Davidic king and the Davidic promise of that king. It centers around one man, David. From chapter 1 to the end of the book, the central figure in the book is David, and David alone. There are no others. What I love about the book is it captures both the success of David and his greatness, as well as his failure. What the book of the book of 2 Samuel does is show us very clearly that while there was a messianic promise made clear back in Genesis chapter 3, this book of 2 Samuel shows very clearly that David was not the Messiah. David was not the one who would lead them into the eternal kingdom. There was yet another Messiah to come, and he would be promised in the book of 2 Samuel. The promise would be more clearly defined in the book of 2 Samuel. We'll talk about that at the end of this discussion. So again, while it chronicles David, it chronicles both his successes and his failures. Some of David's successes include the unification of the nation. After a period of time, he finally overcomes the threat to his monarchy by Saul's family and unifies the nation. But it doesn't just unify the nation, it also shows the expansion of the nation. As we enter the book of 2 Samuel, Jerusalem is not even held by Israel. Jerusalem is held by the Jebusites. So another important success for David was his conquest of Jerusalem. If you've gone to Israel with us, you've walked the Jebusite tunnel maybe, or you've gone through Hezekiah's tunnel. But if you get a chance, it's important to walk the Jebusite tunnel, because that's the tunnel that David came through to take the city of Jerusalem and finally take possession of that from the Jebusites. As that war was going on, as that war was happening, something important happens, and there's a restriction made by David that hadn't been made by God. It's very interesting as you read the book. As you read the book, you'll find out that the Jebusites basically in taunt to David say, yeah, send your blind people and send your lame people if you want to take the city, because that's basically all you are, is a bunch of blind and lame people that are going to come take the city. Because of that, David makes a proclamation that no one will enter the temple grounds who is blind or lame. That was never given by God as a restriction for entering the temple. Yet we see that restriction continue even into the New Testament with the blind man sitting by the beautiful gate when Peter and John walk through and he seeks to be healed. It's interesting that is all because of a taunt made by the Jebusites against David. We see David's purchase of the threshing floor, which would become the place where the temple would eventually be built. That had not been in the possession of Israelite until David buys the threshing floor. We see many of David's military victories as he expands the kingdom. We see him defeat the Philistines. We see him defeat the Moabites and the Arameans and the Edomites. We also see his spiritual victories that he has, and his establishment and his desire to see a temple built. We see in his successes the building of the city of David, his building of his own palace, and just the amazing things that he does as we see the success of David. But we also see the brutally honest failures of David. We are shown very clearly that David is not a man without blemish. He's not a man without spot. In fact, David really, at some points, isn't a very nice man. He's not someone that seems to be all that heroic, and I think that's on purpose. That's on purpose so that we can recognize that while David was great, David wrote beautiful psalms. David was a man after God's own heart. He was not a perfect man. He was a man with flaws and failures, just like you and me, just like you and me. But he was a man that God used to accomplish a perfect purpose. We see some of his failures when he committed adultery with Bathsheba. When David was supposed to be out at war, like all kings were going to do in that time period, David stayed back. David rested to let his army do the work and fell into sin. Actually, he didn't fall into sin. He chose to sin with Bathsheba. We see his murder of Uriah in order to cover up that sin. We see really the incredible dissolution of his family, which included rape and murder and rebellion. And David's family would continue to struggle even after David dies in the ascension of Solomon to the kingship. We see David on the run from his own son Absalom. We see also a rebellion of Sheba, who tries to take over the kingdom as well. So when we see David, we see incredible success, but we also see incredible failure. But we see in 2 Samuel the promise of the Davidic king, 2 Samuel chapter 7. It is a super important chapter in redemptive history because it lays out the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant is the covenant in which God promised David in chapter 7 there would always be a king after his line to rule in Israel forever, that there would be an eternal kingship. Jesus would refer to this as the one who would be both the Lord of and the Son of David, as he argued with the Pharisees. We know now that king would be King Jesus. And it's exciting to see the King Jesus, the perfect Messiah, the one who had no spot, the one who had no blemish, the one who was perfect in every way. And so it's exciting to see Jesus fulfill all the Davidic kingship without any of the blemishes or any of the spots. Because David is the central figure of the book, really the book divides itself into two main sections of an outline. The first section is the reign of David. And it basically just is from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 20. And it just walks through the things we talked about. The things we talked about are there in the reign of David. All those good things, all those bad things are listed there in the reign of David. And you read those all the way from chapter 1 through chapter 20. And you'll start off being just super excited about David. And as you get to chapter 20, you'll be a little disappointed. In fact, you'll probably be a lot disappointed because David had so much promise, and yet he squandered. It feels like he squandered that promise. And yet, it was God who would be faithful to his promise to David to always have a king on the throne after his line. It means something that has nothing to do with David's faithfulness, but everything to do with God's faithfulness. The second major section of the book is what I call the epilogue. The epilogue of the book really is again, it's not chronological. It's just a section which talks about it's basically a summary of David's kingship and God's work in David's kingship. It starts off with the Lord's judgment of Israel, the nation, because of their sin. You're going to see that especially as you get into 1st and 2nd Kings, how Israel is judged because of sin and how important the king is in leadership into God's promises or away from God's promises. And you'll see that as you get into 1st and 2nd Kings. But you see the Lord's judgment on Israel first. You see David's heroes. Who were the heroes for David? Who helped David? Who were the guys who were really special to him? one of those guys being his prophet named Nathan. You see, David's song of praise. In all the Psalms, there are a lot of Psalms, but in Samuel, 2 Samuel, there's one major song, and it's 2 Samuel chapter 22, and that is David's song of praise to God because of what God had done for him. We see in 2 Samuel chapter 23 David's last words. The last words of David are found in 2 Samuel 23. It should be a very important chapter because it's the last words of the heroic king, the King David, the one who would unite Israel. We see a listing of David's mighty men also in chapter 23, and what's amazing to me is the accomplishments of those mighty men and how they fared in battle. But what's just so sad to me is when you read one of the last guys in the list is a guy named Uriah the Hittite. One of David's mighty men was a man he had killed. One of the guys who went with David through thick and thin, who had served alongside David, who had rooted for David when no one else was rooting for David. One of those mighty men was Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband. And David not only stole his wife, he stole his life. That's a sad statement for me. And then what is really tragic is at the end of the book, the Lord judges David. In chapter 24, verse 1, the Lord is not happy with what Israel is doing, and so he raises up, he incites David to take a census. And that leads to David sinning, because David takes the census, and we know from Deuteronomy that a king was not supposed to take a census. It was not his place. And even Joab, not my favorite guy in the world, even Joab warned David against taking the census, and yet he chose to do it anyway. What's interesting is, and you can do this, compare and contrast 2 Samuel 24, verse 1 with 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1. And answer a question for me. Who incited David to take the census? Was it God or was it Satan? What's interesting to me is in 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, God incites David to take the census. 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, Satan incites David to take the census. So I'll give you the answer. It's yes. It's yes. Much like Job is tested by God, so was David. What spiritual lessons do we take from 1 and 2 Samuel? I think the spiritual lessons we take from 1 and 2 Samuel is this, that God is faithful to his word. And wherever you are, God is faithful to his word, both in the good and in the bad. God is faithful to accomplish his purpose in you. I think James chapter 1, verse 2 is a great chapter to look at. Actually, James chapter 1 is a great chapter to look at as we understand our own temptations and our own growth, that trials come from God and trials come from Satan, and they're both designed to make us stronger, both designed to produce in us growth, much like David's incitement to take the census and Job's testing in Job. I hope you have a great time reading the book. I hope you have a great time in understanding what's going on. I hope you grow as you are acquainted with David and God's Davidic dynasty.